It's ad break time. The Beyond Solitaire podcast is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations, and as usual, they are up to some amazing things. They recently concluded a successful campaign on Backer Kit for Eyeball to Eyeball, a LARP about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Late pledges should be available soon. CLGS is also still offering a certificate in applied game design, and the next class is going to be It's All in the Cards, designing card and card-driven games, taught by Damon Stone. He is a brilliant teacher, and his students absolutely love him, so you should sign up. The course starts on August 26th. But for now, I'm super happy to be here for Season 9. Let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, here in my new, extremely messy office in St. Paul, and I have a very special guest on the podcast. This is Yoni Goldstein. He is a filmmaker, and he's also the designer of an upcoming game, Chicago 68. How you doing, Yoni?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm super happy to talk to you about your game. So let's just start with the game, and then let's maybe move out into the context around your game. So Chicago 68, what is it about?
Sure. Chicago 68 is a historical conflict game about the 1968 Democratic National Convention and the summer of riots and civil unrest. Players are going to take on the role of either the establishment or the demonstrators. It's an asymmetrical game with street battles, radical theatrics, and machine politics. The game itself only focuses really on the last 3 days of the convention, when there was like a lot of tear gas, a lot of political pranks, and all sorts of like mischiefs that were happening in the streets, and also kind of like what it culminates in, which was the nomination of Hubert Humphrey to run against Richard Nixon in the presidential election of that year. It has a lot of surprising parallels to our current moment, at least the historical context does. We're dealing with a time of unpopular foreign wars, assassinations, presidents stepping down, vice presidents trying to take over, really kind of like dealing with, America in a state of democratic crisis. And, this is a game that I started working on in 2020, so I wasn't planning it being as relevant as it is today. And of course, there's a lot of like divergences historically, but it is the theme of the game and some of the concepts that I'm happy to talk about.
Yeah, I was gonna say, wow, this doesn't sound familiar at all. I'm
Yeah.
not terrified of the state of democracy in the United States.
Well, it didn't
So-
turn out too well in 1968, but hopefully we could do better in 2024.
Indeed. So
Yeah.
I actually didn't know there had been riots at this Democratic National Convention. I remember learning about the election in school, but not about the riots. So why did they happen?
Yeah,
What and how does that reflect in the game?
sure. Yeah, why did they have it? And of course, like, some people will say, was it a riot? Was it an uprising? Was it social upheaval? Who was rioting? Were the demonstrators rioting or were the police rioting? All these questions are very relevant. But to give you a little bit of historical context, so 1968 is a year that's known for a lot of like social uprisings and social movements and insurgencies, student rebellions, things like that, all over the world, right? So not just in Chicago, in Paris, in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, in Tokyo. There's sort of like a moment in which kind of like the collective action sort of takes over in all these sort of like metropoles, right? Even kind of like in the Soviet Union as well, in Prague, there's a lot of sort of continuity in sort of like the political mood at the time. Um, 1968 is a year that opens with the Tet Offensive. So, like already there's this, like the moral horror of like the Vietnam War kind of like unfolding, and a lot of sort of like conventional wisdom around, what America is like up to abroad, right? Becomes, like upended. And you have the assassination of Martin Luther King, and there's actually like riots in Chicago then. And then there's the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Um, LBJ steps down because the war that he's propping up is like proving to be disastrous. And there is sort of like this feeling that politics as usual is just not working. And you have the whole class of alienated young people um, kind of hooking up with the civil rights movement, hooking up with other sort of with nonviolent movements, but also with like, like a newfound, I don't know, like these sort of very militant groups, like whether underground and the Black Panthers and all sorts of like groups like organizing um sort of like these like organizing around radical politics and revolutionary politics. um so in 1968, when the Democrats were having this open convention, um there was sort of like more than now, I think, right? There was sort of a lot of like political tensions around who would be the nominee. So you had Hubert Humphrey, who was the VP of LBJ, and he was sort of seen as a hawk who would continue like the LBJ's war policies. And then the anti-war candidate was a man named Eugene McCarthy, a senator who, I don't know, sort of embraced the anti-war position at some point, but also was kind of like an aloof, kind of like slightly embarrassed, maybe a little bit like literary, poetic person, who maybe didn't see himself as a president, but was nevertheless the sort of the champion of the anti-war movement. And so a lot of like disaffection and dissatisfaction, I think, was happening. And you have sort of like the rise of this like these like demonstrators, the Youth International Party, or the Yippies, who saw themselves as like revolutionaries who would use like spectacle, like media spectacle, as a way of like raising like a revolutionary consciousness in America. You have like this like motley group of civil rights activists, anti-war activists, who are going to come to Chicago. Um, and you have the party bosses, right? Some machine politics that Chicago is famous for, uh, with Mayor Richard Daley taking a very aggressive posture against the demonstrators, not giving them permits, denying them certain rights to rally, and they wanted to encamp in one of the parks. Um, so, you would get 5,000 National Guard troops coming to Chicago. We've got over like 1,000 Secret Service agents and FBI agents milling around. The entire Chicago police force, 12,000 people, men, put on 12-hour shifts. You really get this like a very tense situation. Before that, they'll have like the city was hosting all sorts of like military style drills they were running in preparation for the demonstrators, and the demonstrators likewise were organizing themselves in this kind of very like militant fashion where they were like assigning committees with marshals, and doing sort of like self-defense training, and all that, running through drills themselves, like ready to like soak up violence. And they knew that there would be violence because they knew that they were going to march and rally illegally. They knew that there was kind of like a kinetic as well as an ideological battleground here. And when that week started, when Convention Week started in August 1968, um, there was already police raids and sweeps and tear gas and just general sort of kind of chaos taking over. The demonstrators wanted to disrupt the convention, right? They wanted to show America that this was, like that this was kind of a sham, and the state responded aggressively, and they also responded aggressively. So it was a uh, it was a perfect storm of a lot of anger and frustration that kind of like was kind of circling the counterculture. Um, the base of coming back to the game, the basis of the game is the Walker Report, which was a government study of the convention riots and to kind of try to understand what happened. And the government study sort of identified the sort of loss over sort of the command and control structure within the police ranks as a police riot. It describes it as a police riot, and um, like this, these sort of like, all these sort of like eyewitness accounts, all these sort of like, like experiences that people were having, like both like from the point of view of the police, the National Guard, but also from the point of view of like bystanders who were there, news media who was there, and the demonstrators themselves, are going to show up in the event card systems in the game itself, and like I pull in sort of primary source documents and all that. So yeah, it's something I have to say, like as somebody who came here to Chicago, now I don't know what, like more than a decade ago. The 1968 Convention riots is a shadow that hangs over. Um, I don't know. Every time we engage in activism, every time we engage in rallies and protests, like every time we see kind of like the riot police showing up with the kind of same powder blue helmets that they were wearing in 1968, they still wear today. Um, like it's something that like we're very, very aware of.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned a bit about what's going on mechanically in the game, but so
Yeah.
this is really, really cool context, I think, for where this game is set, what it's going to do. But who who exactly did you choose to represent in the game?
Okay.
How did you mechanically do it? And then like who did you leave out? Because there's a whole lot of different parties who are kind of involved in this clearly.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the game itself only takes place in over 3 days, and 3 days are represented as 5 rounds. Each round is basically half a day. So you have like a daytime events and then nighttime events, and this plays out in the way that sort of like the consequences of each actions, because they're going to have things were very different at night than they were during the day. But mechanically, just basically, it's an action selection system that's based on card play. One of the kind of unique thing is that each side, the demonstrators and the establishment, each have two unique hands that they're playing from. One hand represents the rank and file, and the other one represents the leadership. Um, so the leadership hands for at least for the establishment is Mayor Richard Daley, and this also kind of includes the party bosses and other sort of like establishment powers that are working behind the scenes to set policies, things like that. Um, they're essentially kind of like manipulating the board state, creating kind of like they're activating a tableau of cards that allow them, like allow the rank and file faction, which is the Chicago Police Department, different abilities and sort of like tactical possibilities, right? So that's one side. The other side, the demonstrators are also playing with two hands. Their leadership hand is the Youth International Party. So there's sort of like a small group of agitators. They're also creating a tableau of street theater cards, which is a kind of like a mix of like an event system and also sort of like mini objectives. So they're moving across the map, they're getting their agitators into position, and that allows them to um, basically control and manipulate the tempo of the game and certain kind of like like special card effects that are going to happen depending on like when and where these demonstrator units are going to be. And then for the demonstrators, the rank and file, I it's the national mobilization to end the war in Vietnam, which was shortened to the MOB. And that's sort of like a kind of a catch-all kind of group of demonstrators that includes, like sort of like organized and like disorganized members, like people who were showing up because they were, interested in civil rights, because they were opposed to like U.S. empire. They might be like, amongst them was like Allen Ginsberg, chanting Om and like leading people into kind of like these like meditations. You have like, the French poet Jean Genet. You have like very sort of like diverse group of people. Also, members of the Black Panther Party, even the Young Lords. So you have kind of like a lot of different sort of groups, and they, this is where in order for the game to kind of like play out, I had to kind of be as inclusive as possible within this like group of people. And essentially, like what both sides are trying to do, the game has two victory conditions. One is what I call exposure. And exposure is basically like a kind of like victory points that the players are going to get when they resolve conflict in their favor. It's sort of like representing the ability to get the media's attention, get sort of like positive report, like in the moment, in like, basically history as it's unfolding. But it's also kind of like with a longer view, it's about controlling like the narrative, right? Like, what do people remember? This is a game about sort of like the making of history, right? The other victory condition is getting your candidate nominated as the presidential candidate. And this is kind of like this is more on the political dimension. Can you maneuver politically within the convention center to get your candidate of choice? And this is basically a sort of a cube pull out of a delegate bag, and then you're placing the cubes onto the delegate track, and you're trying to get the most delegates sort of committed to your nominee by the end of the game. So for the demonstrators, that's Eugene McCarthy, and for the establishment, it's Hubert Humphrey. Now, the establishment wins by meeting both victory conditions. So they have to compete both in the political domain, but they also have to be able to enforce law and order on the street level, right? And which is how you get exposure. The demonstrators will start out in a weaker position, right? They're always going to be dominated by like establishment forces. They're outnumbered and outgunned, but they only have to win one of these two victory conditions. So this leads them to be a lot more reactive and unpredictable, because they can pivot from the political dimension to street battles and back and forth, right? They can engage in clashes, and if the establishment is going to position all its resources and firepower on making arrests, they're going to neglect like the sort of politicking and sort of the cigar-filled back rooms of the convention, which creates an opening for the demonstrators to get in there and cause disruption. So that's the, I would say, like the overview of the game.
Nice. And then it is super interesting to interview about this game at this time because you're going to the Democratic National Convention soon. What are the dates again? It's soon.
Yeah. Um, I think it's August 19th through the 22nd. But there are going to be convention events, you know, from leading up to that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so, what are you going to be doing there? And then, what connections do you see between your actual life right now and your game?
Sure. So yeah, like I mentioned before, like I'm a filmmaker, and I have been hired to be media, right? When I'm not working on films as a cinematographer, I'm often working cameras at different, um, you know, events or things like that. And so there were actually like a number of Biden events I was supposed to be present for. I don't know if they're actually going to switch over into Harris events. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I will be at the convention. At the very least, I'll be in downtown Chicago. Um, I have a number of events with like that are game related, coordinated with the various like activist groups who are going to be showing up. The various like artistic and playful responses to the convention. And so yeah. I mean, in case it wasn't clear, you know, I live in Chicago. Chicago's my like adopted hometown. We've been all sort of like watching, like sort of like national events and knowing that they're going to come home pretty soon, and it's going to be pretty intense. I think there's going to be protests. There are going to be sort of like counter convention events, and you know, I'm cursed with living in interesting times and in interesting places.
For sure. So, this also leads me to another question, which is you've chosen to express your interest in and thoughts about the 68 riots through a board game. But you're also, I mean, you're an artist in your day-to-day life. You know how to film, you know how to report, you know how to record. What made you decide to express yourself in board game form when other avenues were open to you?
Sure. So this takes us back to the summer of 2020. As you can remember, we were all in COVID lockdown.
Yeah, that's how
Um,
this podcast got started.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's when I started listening to your podcast, and got really interested in historical games. And of course, as like a filmmaker and a media maker, I'm, at home, like in this very room, sitting around thinking, okay, like maybe films aren't being made anymore, right? Like, what are the protocols for, a kind of art form that is collaborative and collective and requires you to be in close proximity to people and sharing small spaces, and like maybe this is just not a thing that's going to happen for a while. um, so I started sort of looking around and like thinking about the way that games, especially like historical games, are similar to films. I come from the world of like nonfiction. I mean, really kind of like more like avant-garde experimental nonfiction, but still kind of like rooted in the practice of like documentary, rooted in like a research-based way of making media. Um, and a good game for me is about the duration of a film. 90 minutes to 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, maybe sometimes. Um, and a good game, like a good film, it has a sort of like has certain like emotional arcs. It has narratives. Ideally, it's a little bit unpredictable, right? It gets you like invested. I'm more interested, I think, with films as I am with games and like in systems and ideas than I am like, with a specific character. So that's, immediately appealing to me too about games. And and yeah, and I found the process of making a game to be very similar to the process of making a documentary. Like you're doing a lot of archival research, you're reading a lot of primary source documents, you're spending a lot of time thinking about counterfactuals, how this, reality that we exist in might have branched off into other realities. Are things inevitable? Were there like different like political horizons available, or could have been sort of opened up for us? Like what is the shape of things, right? How can we tell this story? What perspective do we take? So that got me thinking. Uh, and I was also interested at that time in like games by Chicago, which there are a few of, but there's not enough of. And I came across a game by Jim Dungan called Chicago, Chicago, um, with a subtitle, which I can't exactly remember right now, but it's something like um, or Mrs. Leary, where's your cow when we really need it, or when we really need you? It's like but it was a game that he sort of whipped up um, and published in his magazine about the Chicago '68, right? And it was really interesting, right? I picked up, well, I made my own copy of it and I started playing it, and I was really interested in it as a sort of like what it was, which I think was primarily like a political thought piece more than like, you know, necessarily like a well sort of tested game. But it was interesting to explore that game, like to explore like Chicago history, and especially like the history of social movements with war games, um, which at that time I was really sort of getting to know. And I started iterating on that game, and that's like the sort of the spiritual predecessor of Chicago '68. At the same time, there was also the George Floyd protests in Chicago, as well as elsewhere, right, everywhere. And I happened to live not very far from the mayor's house. The mayor at the time was Lori Lightfoot, and all of a sudden, like we see Chicago in a state of crisis, right? With riots, with uprisings, with the demonstrators in the streets, with sort of like improvised sort of manifestations of people, with the National Guard. It didn't happen in Chicago, but at that time, I also remember stories about like, unmarked vans coming up and snatching protesters and things like that. And so I remember I went to a Black Panther rally in like in the South Side, and then walked past like a van full of like Secret Service agents, very conspicuously there. So it was sort of like an echo of 1968, and that was the genesis of the game. I didn't realize at the time that the DNC will be in Chicago in 2024. I didn't know how long a game will take to, um, you know, design, and test, and develop, and find a publisher and all that. So, yeah, here we are.
That's amazing. So speaking of finding a publisher, how long did you work on this game before signing it? And why did you choose to work with the Deets Foundation?
Sure. So for a couple of years, it was just a game that I was designing for myself because it's a game that I wanted to play. Um, I wanted the kind of like war gamey, type approach um, to this issue, right? I wanted to sort of see more games about social movements being represented, and but I also wanted this like political dimension, right? I wanted this like idea of like performance and art being part of a historical conflict, right? And so that kind of became the game of design. And then I approached, at some point I felt like, okay, I actually have something that I think other people are enjoying playing with me, right? And so I approached a number of different publishers. Um, at the end, I went for the Deets Foundation because one, they're Illinois based. Two, they're a nonprofit, and that was actually like really interesting to me, as like somebody who is not necessarily pursuing game design from like a career perspective. I was approaching it more as something, like I said, it's like making like a weird little like indie film, right? And so the notion that like I could work with like a nonprofit, and also with a publisher who had a very kind of like um, I mean, I would say maybe like a hands-off approach, just like very much like honoring like the artist's vision of what the game could be, right, or what games could do in general. Very open to me sort of like suggesting whatever like artists I wanted to work with. So like I'm obviously kind of like coming from like the visual art and design world, and so like I really wanted to produce something that was also like visually interesting, and not just well illustrated, but also kind of like contained within it a lot of like ideas that like in concepts, right, that the game was trying to convey, like in the artwork itself. So um you know the like Deets Foundation was actually like super awesome about sort of like you know paying artists and advancing the like payment for them. And then I also like got linked up with Joe Dewhurst, who is an amazing experienced developer, and like worked on some of my like favorite games in the last couple of years, and some games I'm really looking forward to. um and then also like and then also shout out to my brother Renan Goldstein, who like in 2020 showed me how to put a game together and components together for the game crafter, and how to like make uh you know a tabletop simulator model, so then we can like run hundreds of playtest hours on, which would not have been possible with just the like cutting out cards for the thousandth time. You know, um, yeah, yeah. I know. Does that give you kind of like a little bit of a history?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And you mentioned Joe, who's been on this
yeah,
podcast. I also enjoy his work as a developer. What was y'all's process together like as you developed Chicago 68?
sure. So yeah, as soon as we had a publisher, at that time the team was me and Renan, my brother. Uh, I was trying to think of like, okay, like um who can really like develop this, because I wanted to take the game out of the sort of like immediate circle of like players in Chicago who were interested in Chicago history, or were interested in conflict based games, and so I started thinking about okay, who are the developers making these types of games, and honestly like there aren't that many. And the best ones all were all sort of like attached to Joe. And so I reached out to Joe. Joe said yes. I think instantly. Uh, I joined the 12 other games projects that he's involved in. Um, and he really, I mean, he really just just kicked it up a notch, right? He built a Discord. He got like helped like kind of like coordinate playtests. He like is like has and is like reviewing every single card in the game, which is a game that has over 140 cards. Like constantly like looking over and revising the game book, the reference book, and then on top of that, there's like the solo mode, right? Which is like, I'm really excited about, which like Joe and I developed. Yeah, yeah, he's been amazing. It's like, I think, actually, like thinking back about it, it was my conversations with Dan Bullock, another designer, and Dan, told me like, if it's going to be your first game, make sure you work with a developer. There are a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that you just need like another set of eyes on. And yeah, he was right. I would actually say that I was really surprised. I didn't realize that developing or a game and being part of a game development was going to be as fun as designing it, but it actually like, I don't know, for me, like, I don't know, kind of like lights up my pleasure centers, just sitting around thinking about, um, you know, edge cases and rules exceptions and, little things that like, all the way all the little pieces kind of fit together.
Excellent. And you brought up solo mode, which is something I was going to ask you. See, you just lead in the right direction. So your game can be played in multiple ways. So it's 1 to 4 players. You can have competitive mode. There's a cooperative scenario of some kind based on PGG, and there's also solo. So why did you choose to offer all of these modes, and what are you trying to express with each of them?
Sure. Um, yeah, so the game has always been about two competing sides, right? The demonstrators and the establishment. It's also always been um, sort of like the sort of like story about bifurcations within both sides, right? Um, it's not, it's never been like a semi co-op or anything like that, right? Like the sort of the two factions, the rank and file and the leadership that are contained within each side are more or less working together, right? The demonstrators especially are dealing with like like ruptures within the movement, sort of like tensions and counter-revolutionary sort of like things that are happening with them, but they're dealing with it, as an ideological sort of like entity. And I wanted to like preserve that. Uh, while kind of like on the establishment side, you also have these like two sides, right? And so when you're playing in a two-player mode, you're playing from both hands simultaneously, right? When you're playing it in 3 or 4, basically it's essentially like a 2v2 or a 1v2 kind of situation, where like you're kind of splitting off the sides into separate players. In the solo mode, I guess like I was interested in a game which allowed you to uh, play as the demonstrators working against the establishment. And the reason it works that way and not the other way around is because the demonstrators really are the sort of chaos agents, right? The establishment, which at the time was known as sort of like the democratic political machine, um, has a sort of a clear objective, and so it lent itself to be able to be like automated in some way, right? There's this sort of like interaction between a display of policies and the actions it can do, which can lead to very sort of like uh, interesting combinatorial sort of like effects that are very variable in every game, but um, it has sort of like a, whether it's a human or non-human opponent, it has sort of a clear mission of what it's trying to do throughout the game. And so the demonstrators in the solitary mode have this like really interesting way of playing where they could, where they're essentially like every time they do something, it creates like it places in kind of like an active token in a certain city area on the board. And then this drives the establishment's attention. Um, and it allows kind of like really interesting moves where you can get at something that is in the solo mode that I think like it's actually kind of like much harder to achieve in sort of the multiplayer mode, where you can create kind of like a distraction in one part of the city and then sneak your agitators into another part of the city, and then like create kind of like this the sense of like actually being able to move from like a large body of demonstrators in sort of in the streets to infiltrating sort of like these sensitive areas where, for example, at the Hilton Hotel where the delegates were staying, or in the convention hall itself. So like there's something kind of captured there in the solo mode that isn't captured in the multiplayer mode, which is having something else is happening there, right? You have this, the dynamic of head to head sort of play. And because like this sort of built-in idea of like kind of like two factions contained within one side, you can also turn it into a cooperative game by splitting the actions of the leadership and the rank and file between two players, and you can play against the establishment machine player.
Nice. And then just kind of like I guess, a higher level question. In whatever mode they're playing, we're living in interesting times, as we mentioned earlier in the interview, and especially in terms of political fraudness of our times. What are you hoping that people will get from your game when they play it?
Sure. So yeah, even though I have like pretty kind of like obvious like leftist political leanings, like I don't think this is a game about clear cut sort of like moral statements about demonstrators and the establishment, right? It's not like I actually like I work pretty hard actually to make the establishment player feel like they're also kind of like performing a historical role um, that has like that has an ethical logic to it, right? You're and then part of it honestly is because like when I was early days of playtesting, like everybody wants to play the demonstrators, so I'm playing the establishment, I'm playing the cops, and it is about sort of like like the well, I mean, honestly speaking, like it's not as though the establishment has some sort of master switch so they can flip to like end the Vietnam War, right? There's not like a single card you can play to like make the peace plank be the the Democratic Party platform. So I was hoping to kind of give like sort of like a deeper understanding of the way that systems come to be, um, as determined by the circumstances in which those systems exist. So what I mean by that is that every game starts with each side playing essentially with a tableau of cards that are going to give shape to their sort of strategic and tactical possibilities. Um, and for the most part, those cards are random, and there are a lot of cards, and so you're not actually going to ever really be playing with a full deck street theater cards with demonstrators or policy cards for the establishment. In fact, you're going to play with maybe like, I don't know, maybe like half or at most 3/4 of those cards. And those cards, the sequence in which they come out and their abilities, they kind of create a string of events that you can play with or play against, and that might lead to, I don't know, it might lead to the mayor and the police being actually like very rational, drawing down, allowing free speech, being able to get like positive media exposure without necessarily like cracking skulls and firing tear gas into crowds of reporters. And the demonstrators likewise can work towards, like nonviolent resistance. It's harder, but it's also more sort of like strategically rewarding, and also kind of like there's definitely sort of like a path to victory in that way. Yeah, that's it overall. I mean, I guess if I had to kind of like narrow it down, this is a game about collective action, right? Which is something that neither the establishment nor the demonstrators were able to like truly control.
Nice. All right, so this is the perfect time to have you maybe tell us, do you know when it's coming to Kickstarter before I ask you some Softy questions?
Yeah. So the game is coming to Kickstarter on August 6th.
Oh, soon.
Yeah, very soon. It will be up for 30 days, so it will be concurrent with the Democratic National Convention in Chicago this year as well.
That's some good timing, man.
Yeah.
All right, so for your Softy questions, what games have you been playing recently that bring you joy?
Well, most recently, a little known game called Arcs. We just finished our
What's
first
that?
campaign. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, after this interview, I'm going to go teach base Arcs to another player so that we can get another campaign going with a different group of players. Arcs is great. I think it the fact actually that it's that it only plays 2 to 4 players means that there's like kind of like a long queue of people in my game group who want to play it, and so I have to teach them a couple of sort of early games of base Arcs, and then totally like reformat their strategic thinking around the campaign, because I really love the way the campaign brings in role playing. I love the way that it kind of like allows you to like embody certain kind of personalities and strategies. And then you also have to kind of like shift to, like make decisions about, are you going for power or are you going for your fate? And I've really enjoyed that. Before that, we were doing rounds of PAX Penning, which we really enjoyed. Really enjoyed Fred Saval's Just of Robin Hood. Yeah, those have been sort of like our sort of go-to games for the past couple of play sessions.
Fantastic. And if people want to know what you're up to online, and they want to track your work, where can you be found?
Sure. Well, they can find out more about the game at 1968games.com. That you can go to. I'm on Twitter as Halfly Hoping. I'm on Instagram with my brother. We made like a little group called Color Swim Games, and we're on Facebook. Yeah, as well. You can search for the Chicago 68 Facebook page and find us there as well. And of course on BGG Chicago 68.
Fantastic. And for those of you who don't know, I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. Yoni, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a delightful conversation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, everybody out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.